So our next speaker, his name is Boysen. He will gladly introduce himself, if that's okay. Who's going to be doing the Autistic Dietitian speech today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting. So I'm Aaron, and obviously I am, as the title says, an autistic dietitian. So I have, I think at the time I got diagnosed when I was younger with Asperger's syndrome. And obviously now that sort of definition is gone, and the term autistic is used for the majority of individuals. Now, on the discussion of the talk with Nusrat and the title, it was, I think we had discussions around it. She talked about the words like neurodiversity in dietetics, and I particularly wanted to use the word autistic in there, and I particularly wanted to use non-first person language and use sort of identity first language. And the reason why is because as an autistic individual, and it's quite common among other autistic individuals, actually it's a fundamental part of who we are, who our sort of background, what makes us who we are, our talents, our strengths, our abilities, our weaknesses, and that's hence the reason the use of identity first language. So I prefer myself to use the autistic person diagnosis, and I'm particularly passionate also about using the term autistic, not just for myself. I also have a son who actually 3 years old and recently got diagnosed with autism as well, so almost just for him as well, to sort of represent autistic individuals and sort of get out there, get the information out there that are obviously our strengths and our abilities and things we can do, and also talk about some struggles and challenges that we have. So I explained a little bit about myself. So I didn't want Sophie to give an introduction because you'd talk about, if we go to the next slide, talk about things that maybe just aren't relevant for the talk, and really wanted to talk about myself. So obviously my interest in dietetics actually started off as what's called a special interest, and that's an area that a lot of autistic people often get really interested in a topic, read a lot about it, and basically, if I'm going to obsess about a certain topic, want to talk about it all the time, want to discuss certain things all the time. So I was reading lots of nutrition research and lots of different things around it. Obviously you can add it in with sort of the regular sorts of like young teenage boy sort of attitude, going to the gym and things like that. However, I would talk about it all the time, talk about it with my family, go in long speeches about a certain topic and talk about different areas. And frankly, they were probably quite sick of it. And I think my sister said to me, why don't you become, I met my friends, had a consultation with a dietitian, why don't you look into doing that? And obviously that spurred my interest, and I've obviously continued through it. So, however, the journey to becoming a dietitian and how I actually got there is probably not as easy as I thought it would be. Because obviously those of us were all dietitians or student dietitians. Probably student dietitians feel this maybe a bit more viscerally. There's a lot of communication, there's a lot of discussing with patients and things like that. It's not just your ability to have a long didactic speech about a particular topic and share all your knowledge with the patient that makes you a good dietitian. I can do that really, really easily. Like Olivia, one of the BDA committee, was with us on placement as a student, and she would ask me a question about something related to critical care nutrition, and bless her, I probably taught for ages that I gave her all the information possible, but I sort of felt like she was asking for all that information. But and Nusrat's laughing because obviously I work with her quite on a daily basis, and she's probably experienced me go off on a little bit too long about a certain topic. So it was often quite difficult to manage a lot of these communication things, because often your communication is quite analysed. And I mean, through my life I've had to engage in practices such as a practice called masking, where you sort of are almost acting in a role. And obviously during placement and things like that, due to the nature of everything, I didn't feel like I had any choice but to do that, and almost not be myself and almost play a role in clinic and tick the boxes and get through and build those competencies. But as my career developed and I was able to find dietetic departments, and I want to shout out my most recent dietetic department, which was Bradford Teaching Hospitals, and I can't thank them enough for sort of leaning into my strengths. But I discovered that early in my career that I enjoy problem solving, I enjoy building pathways, I enjoy clinical conversations in the MDT. Probably, again, still need to rein it in a little bit sometimes because people might not want as much detail as I'm willing to give them, but I sort of justify it by saying I'm sort of showing my clinical reasoning. Most people don't want that much clinical reasoning in the discussion. But I started to develop, this is what I actually enjoy. I found the format of clinics, whether I could do them, I found them very tiring, and I was naturally drawn to areas, as you can imagine, such as ICU, and it definitely came more naturally to me, that sort of environment. Reduced communication with patients, as a lot of them are sedated and ventilated. Also, the conversations aren't very long, they're very sort of short, and I don't feel like in that situation many patients are thinking too much about your communication skills and things like that. And I do, obviously I try my best, but I do, obviously when I do longer form consultations like a clinic, I find it very tiring, so therefore I was naturally drawn to this area, which is quite numbers-based, quite analytical. I think I have lots of talents in remembering lots of information about patients, which helped me during MDT discussions. And I think, before I go on to the next part, I think it's important to also discuss what autism is. So the next slide, I actually have sort of a discussion about what autism is, and it's often described as an autism spectrum. And obviously move over to the next slide. And obviously a spectrum is not from point A to be less autistic and more autistic from one side or another. Every autistic individual has different challenges they have to overcome and different barriers that they face. And these are some of the list of challenges that people may have from the Autistic Society. And even if I think about myself and my son, we often have different challenges in relation to our needs, and obviously autistic individuals, we have low and high support needs based on sort of, as we mentioned about the social model of disability, they have different people that sort of are sort of catered to more towards how society is structured. I think my son, catered to more towards how society is structured, and some of them are great abilities, and some of them maybe don't always inspire much confidence in other people sometimes. So, next slide. Okay, so struggles for myself. I really struggle, so I'm really good at discussing things like, I would much rather over lunchtime discuss a case study or discuss something about dietetics or discuss something about that than my weekend. And often maybe it's not always, I have to sort of rein myself in sometimes because people are sort of saying, maybe I don't want to talk about a case study on my lunchtime or talk about work on my lunchtime, I want a bit more work-life balance and things like that. But I find it far more difficult for myself to talk about what I did on the weekend or what other people did on the weekend or things like that than actually talk about those sorts of things. I actually find it really quite a difficult challenge, and I often sort of maybe retract from certain conversations that I find quite difficult, and I feel like I can't engage as effectively as normal. So I often struggle with things like small talk. Even with MDTs, I would often build relationships more around sort of discussing patients being part of the MDT and those sorts of conversations rather than any chit chat, because I just found it extremely difficult to be able to sort of continue those conversations. And I often sometimes find it difficult in certain structures. We know healthcare is quite hierarchical, and the way structures work, I would sometimes trip over myself and speak out of turn. I think luckily the dietetic department which I worked in actually didn't mind that so much within the dietetic department, but often outside and things like that, I would sometimes speak out of turn if I had certain knowledge on a topic and want to share it. And obviously, in the hierarchy, I wasn't the person who should be answering that sort of question or talking about that sort of process. Sometimes I would struggle to focus on things when things have changed. So I struggle to focus, and when things change or routines change, I would often struggle. And it's not everything, not every change is always a struggle. Some changes I adapt to quite well. I think during COVID, I was quite able to sort of adapt my interest and switch over to a more obsessive interest in supporting COVID patients on the wards, on ICU, and absorbing all that information. But sometimes the small things, the changing of structure, the movement of things around the ward or the ICU, or even such simple as someone sitting in my seat, not my seat, it's not my seat, but the seat that I normally sit in, and that sort of vision, or the sort of, not vision, but the sort of view I usually have around me. Yeah, I found that sometimes quite difficult to concentrate. I would often find any sort of CPD in workplaces quite rigid, and quite difficult to fit in my own sort of learning style and how I like to research and learn about something. And so obviously I would often research a topic continually for multiple weeks at a time, till I exhausted all the easily available resources about the topic, and then would either continue to research that topic or move on. And you can imagine during COVID there was lots of new resources coming out, so for a long time I was very much able to satisfy that special interest, and I knew quite a lot about lots of different things in relation to not only the treatment of patients with COVID-19, but also conditions such as long COVID, but also actually the public health advice and how things were changing and what was happening. So some of the strengths of myself though, I can learn about a topic in a relatively short amount of time, and it's relatively short to other people, but obviously I can often get obsessed with a topic, and it's not hard for me. I actually really love it. Like, I love reading about a certain topic, or if I'm particularly interested in it, I can read about it for fun. I just have to, again, not always talk about it with people, particularly even if I work with them outside of work, because they sort of talk about the thing like work-life balance and things like that, and I think that's a really, really important concept, because actually, for me, I find it really fun and enjoyable and things like that. So often I had a fantastic manager, but she would often say to me, I don't want to hear about these things at later, don't share things you learn at irrelevant times, and not everyone wants to know about them all the time. So yeah. I notice patterns and structures quite easily. So that's often helpful in ICU and critical care and things like that when sort of managing patients. I can often remember large amounts of information about a patient without having to look it up. I can often sort of bring it up, I think. I now work with Nusrat, and she always says that I can remember lots of things about loads of different things, just bring it up without actually looking at any sort of notes or anything like that. And it's often quite useful in an MDT. I don't have to always look at my notes. I often know information about patients as they come up without looking further into the details. And I'm also able to sort of look at patterns and structures, and it's helped me to sort of think about how I work and improve my own productivity and things like that. And I think also I developed quite early on a passion for service design, improving processes, and as a newly qualified dietitian I've heard about other individuals in some other departments where they said, no, that's not your role, get in your box, get on the wards. Because as I go back to the third slide, if we just go back a few, as I go back to the first slide, it's really important to understand if we're supporting people with autism, autistic dietitians, actually it's important to remember that autism is a spectrum, and thinking about their own sorts of support needs, things they might need to enable to get the most out of that individual and sort of lean into their talents and abilities. But thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to accept any questions or anything. Any questions?
So I just wondered, because I know we're talking about the spectrum, do you find that people tend to put people with autism in one box and assume that they have same sort of challenges, or do you find that a very open conversation to have? Do you know, like with colleagues, or
Yeah,
does that make sense?
I think it would. as I said before, I do feel, based on other experiences that I've heard from other people, I do feel like I am quite lucky in that regard. In the places where I've worked, and it has been quite an open conversation, and they're sort of aware of it, and they're able to adapt things. But I do think, from other people that I've talked to, I think that sometimes it is a case putting in that box and sort of sticking with what they would expect from you, or saying lines like, "Oh, but you don't look autistic," or "I wouldn't have recognised you as autistic," or things like that. And I think, especially the one about look autistic, I think that's a little bit, I don't think that's a very nice, I don't think it comes from the wrong place, but again, it sort of brings up those questions: how do you expect a person with autism to look? It's not a look that someone has. It's obviously, it's nothing to do with their looks in a way. But maybe they're using looks as a more encompassing act or something like that. But yeah, so I think probably fit in a certain box, and sometimes it's a challenge just to make sure that people are aware of things. And I think I am relatively privileged in that regard. In sometimes I don't have to share that information, so I can just sort of. Obviously, it's not a pleasant experience all the time, but I can actually almost mask it. Obviously, you wouldn't want someone to do that, but I mean, I know my son is unable to do that, and often it's a discussion that I have to discuss with lots of different people around him. But the reason why he's not responding to you, sort of going, "Hey, how you doing?" isn't because he's being rude. He just, So it's sometimes I understand both sides, and I think, So hopefully that answers the question.
Hello, thank you. So I'm currently on my B placement with Humber, and I'm currently working with a lot of families in paediatrics, and I've come across some families who have children who are like waiting for an assessment for autism, and I understand it's quite a long waiting list. And I just wondered if you got any maybe tips for some support that can be given while maybe the waiting is kind of long and unknown wait for them.
Unfortunately, I don't have anything. Obviously, I'm relatively, as an autistic, I was diagnosed when I was around 10 years old. I had different support needs to my own son, and we're quite fairly, I think, quite lucky that he got his diagnosis relatively quickly. However, it was probably because I knew, obviously being a dietitian within the NHS, knowing how systems work, being able to move things forward, reading nice guidance, knowing exactly how the structure was going to happen, know who, again, I did quite a bit of research about it, so knowing exactly how the structure was going to work, who needed to talk to, the next steps, so I was able to navigate that. And obviously I'm based in Leeds, and Leeds have support their waiting list. They've actually outsourced to a private clinic in Harrogate, which sort of reduced their waiting lists. Also speech and language therapy. We're able to support him in the interim because he was waiting for a diagnosis. So I think it is extremely difficult in that sort of interim period, depending on what's available within the local community. And I think Leeds' services compared to a lot of other areas of the UK are fantastic in that regard. And I feel, even though obviously it's not always ideal, but compared to what I hear from other people, I think it's really, so I don't really have any support or anything like that. I think reading or joining groups or support from other parents is often helpful in that interim.
So my question is, how do I learn more as a dietitian so I can support patients that have autism? Because we learn about behavior change, we learn about maybe reflecting on emotions, but even on my clinical placement, I'm in peds and we have a lot of autistic children. A lot of the parents, they seem like they struggle with maybe food and stuff like that. I feel kind of sometimes hopeless because I'm not sure what advice to provide them. So do you have any advice on how I can maybe learn more about it and then reflect on it or something like that?
I don't work with autistic children. I don't support autistic children. I don't think I would be very good at it. much more suited to ICU, numbers control and things like that. So it's quite helpful in that regard for me. But I think as a parent of a autistic son, I think it's very important. I can understand both perspectives. So sometimes it can be quite challenging for parents. They can be quite frustrated, quite isolated, feel like no one understands them, judged, all those sorts of feelings. However, I think understanding autism and thinking about actually what's the goal here, what can we work with, what are the processes, and obviously exposing them to new foods and trying out different methods and involving them in all those sorts of things. And it is different for every single patient. So I know within sort of eating disorders, and eating disorders are far more common among those with autism. And again, it takes a different approach each time. So it's almost understanding autism and how it manifests, and understanding the rigidity and sometimes the way their thought processes work. And sometimes people within eating disorders have to adapt their approach. And the same with other services. Think about how you can adapt your approach to those with autism, and thinking about how their brain thinks and how it thinks slightly differently, and how certain structures that may best place to go. Also, generally the resource is Autistica. It's a society. They do a lot of webinars around the topic, and I think they do a really good resource package for healthcare professionals, just generally about autism. And they did one about eating disorders and autism, and I thought that was a really good one, even if eating disorders is not necessarily the area. However, I do think it's a helpful discussion to think about how you might adapt your approach in different settings to different individuals. So yeah. Thank you very much.